Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Francis. And thank you, Marlene Linares, also for making this possible with all the logistics. Good afternoon again to our audience. Thank you for attending on a Friday afternoon. Today, the Latin American Iberian Institute at UNM, the History Department, have the pleasure, through my person, to introduce my dear colleague, Ben Smith, Dr. Benjamin Smith, author of The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade, which is, I must say, a highly readable, carefully researched, and very, very important book, not only for historians, but also for the general public's understanding of the country. Dr. Smith is professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick in Great Britain. Besides authoring the book that brings us together today, he has also written several books on Mexican history, spanning popular movements, grassroots politics, violence, religion, and the press, including, more recently and prior to The Dope, one titled The Mexican Press and Civil Society, 1940 to 1976, Stories from the Newsroom, Stories from the Street. He's also co-editor of Dicta Blanda, Politics, Work, and Culture in Mexico, 1938 to 1968, which is an extremely impactful edited volume that, since its publication in 2014, continues to inform historiographical and political debate. Dr. Smith is also an expert witness for refugee cases from Mexico and the United Kingdom and the United States, and a member of the Mexico and Central American program at NORIA, which is an independent and nonprofit research organization. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. Ben Smith. And Ben, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luis, for inviting me, and thank you, Francis, for introducing me. I'm really honored to speak at UNM. I was just saying I'm extremely sad that I'm not there. I should really have been there, but unfortunately, due to various kind of COVID regulations, I couldn't make it to your campus. So I'm afraid I'm doing this over Zoom, but I'm really looking forward, particularly to getting to your responses to some of the ideas I'm going to put forward about my book. Now, I should say this at the beginning. This talk is going to be relatively light, okay? So effectively, I'm just going to talk about three issues. First, why I wrote this book. Secondly, how I wrote it. And thirdly, and I suppose slightly more intellectually, what I found when I tried to write it, right? What were my findings? So over the last few months, I've done quite a lot of press and radio interviews on the book, and people start normally by asking me, why did I start researching the Mexican drug trade? Well, I should say at the outset, this was not my intention. I arrived in Mexico about 2 decades ago, and I didn't come for the drugs or the violence or even the booze, although as a Brit, I did have a kind of sneaking regard for Graham Greene's Whiskey Priest and Malcolm Lowry's kind of mezcal-wasted consul. One for the literary specialist there. Like many naive 20-somethings, I think I came for the politics. And the early 2000s were a kind of dead zone for wannabe radicals. And to a bored London journalist like myself, Mexico seemed the place to be. It had a revolutionary history that was kind of untarnished by famines or pogroms. It had a national palace with kind of comic strip murals of dashing heroes. In 2000, it had a genuine indigenous movement, the balaclava-clad Zapatistas. And when I arrived, they were on tour, like Lollapalooza. And it had legions of social movements. It also had a vibrant cultural scene with a kind of playful disregard for its pushy northern neighbor. And if I came for the politics then, I stayed for the people. And living in southern Mexico, I worked as an English teacher, like many of us did. And I fell in love with the country and the communities and the people's warmth and their kindness, their sense of humor. And when I returned after a year to do a PhD at Cambridge, allegedly on 17th century English alchemy, God knows where I'd be if I'd done that, I immediately gave it up and I started to studying 19th and 20th century Mexican history. And over the next decade or so, I threw myself into researching. As Lewis mentioned, I've researched about Mexican politics, from indigenous lawmakers to market women, to militant religious movements, to anti-communist rebellions, and most recently, Mexico's journalists, editors, and contrarian hacks. I was also very lucky at the time. Don't worry, this personal bit's over soon. I was also very lucky to marry into a kind of vast Mexican family full of terrifying, thundering aunts and quiet, shuffling, good-humored uncles. Like so much of Mexico now, they're spread everywhere, from China to Italy, Brazil, Mexico City, Tijuana, Oaxaca, Los Angeles. They're artists, they sell tacos, they work for NASA. Together, I think we worked out they can cover 3 indigenous dialects: Oaxaca Spanish, Chilango slang, English, both UK and US, Spanglish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. I can tell you Christmas is chaos. They are a Mexican success story, right? And one that represents many of the positive changes that have occurred in Mexico over the past half century. But they are not, however, entirely representative. And in the last 7 or 8 years, 2 forces have pushed me to leave this past and to try to write about the Mexico I can see rather than one I want to imagine. And these 2 things, one is intellectual and one is personal. In terms of the intellectual drive for doing this subject, The Dope is an attempt to understand things that I think a lot of historians have ignored or at least underestimated in the past. The power of the police, the power of coercion, the force and the nature of the illicit economy, the influence of US policy on Mexico, and the influence of a war that has been going on for longer than most of our lifetimes. The Dope is also a bid to contextualize these things, not in the kind of bleak apocalyptic imagery of true crime, but rather in the Mexico I fell in love with, and frankly still exists, not only in the cries of civil society, but also in the people themselves, the Mexicans who make up most of the country. The second cause, I suppose, is much more personal. And over the past 2 decades, tens, probably much nearer hundreds of thousands of Mexicans have fled Mexico for the United States. They have fled everything from land grabs to family feuds, through extortion and kidnapping, to human trafficking and illegal mining and logging. Around 2012, just before I came to the UK, a small handful of lawyers started to approach me, asking me for help assessing the risks to these Mexican refugees and what they faced back in Mexico. And over the next really 5 or 6 years, I sat down occasionally in person, more often on the end of a telephone line to a detention center, and I listened to their stories and I helped put together their petitions for asylum. But their stories pushed me in another way, and that was to understand both the roots of Mexico's contemporary violence, but also how the Mexico I'd lived in and I'd fallen in love with had descended into the Mexico that was forcing so many people to flee. So these were the 2 reasons that pushed me to write the book. My next hurdle was how to do it. Now, as you might expect, researching an illegal industry is kind of a tough job, actually. On the one hand, drug trafficking is enveloped in myths. These myths tell pretty simple stories of a war between North and South, between white and brown, between noble cops and a threatening kind of group of vicious kingpins, corrupt Mexican politicians, and shadowy, powerful cartels. Now, such myths may contain granules of truth, but in essence, they are myths. They are propaganda. They obscure rather than clarify. And they also serve like all propaganda, they serve a clear political purpose. They demonize the drug traffickers and they cement the narrative of the war as a struggle between good and evil. And they legitimize official violence. Drug cops carry guns because they must fight, allegedly, well-armed traffickers. They shoot, but allegedly only when shot at. If the drug trade, then, is shrouded in these myths, it's also shrouded in secrecy. In fact, just tracing the identities of the traffickers themselves is difficult enough. I spent, in actual fact, 2 years on the heels of a guy who the Americans knew as Papa Grande and was the purveyor of, during the late 60s and early 70s, the finest Sin Semilla marijuana to California's counterculture hipster set. but they didn't know his real name. So I had to triangulate the reports and kind of hazy memories of dozens of weed traffickers from the United States with people who had been growing and trafficking marijuana back in Mexico, in Guerrero, in Jalisco, and also in Sinaloa. So this took an enormous amount of kind of triangulation simply to work out who these people were. So it's a fairly kind of tough historical job. Unpacking these myths, pulling aside the veil of secrecy, discovering the real story of Mexico's drug trade then wasn't easy. The stereotypes particularly were firmly entrenched. They configured the way that documents were written, they structured the way we read them, and they shaped the way we've told these stories to each other in the past. But researching the drug trade, I found, was possible. Cataloguing and declassification programs, which I know that Luis has looked into himself, have started to open up political and judicial and private archives on both sides of the border. On the back of a substantial grant that I was lucky enough to get from the British government, I visited about 50 of these collections, from big national archives to dusty scorpion-infested cells that passed for municipal depositories. And I found a wealth of material, from the records of US and Mexican drug police, to the court transcripts of the Guadalajara cartel, to the property titles linking local power owners to major traffickers. And scrupulous triangulation allowed me to trace narcotics from field to chemist, from chemist to wholesaler, and from wholesaler to border smuggler. I combined these orthodox archive sources with a plethora of classified US and Mexican documents. Some came through FOIA applications, Freedom of Information applications. Others came from private collections, which were extremely helpful. They included the photo album of a major Sinaloa kingpin, classified DEA and customs documents from about half a dozen officers, including wiretaps, which I got, like actual tapes of wiretaps of the Guadalajara cartel, the sole known photograph of the legendary trafficker and El Chapo's alleged mentor, Pedro Aviles Perez, which a DEA agent sent to me on a mortuary slab with half his head missing. It was the only photo they ever got of him. So I have to confess, did a load of interviews with those involved in the drug trade. Not all of them were drug traffickers. Many of them were DEA agents who went down to Mexico during the 70s and 80s. And they led me into this kind of what I found was a really murky world of overseas US drug policy. The characters, the clashes, the pretty gung-ho attitude to lives and laws. This culminated actually with one of the officials confirming a rumor that I'd heard that the DEA were basically financing death squads to take out top traffickers down in Mexico. Other contacts were involved in the other side of the trade. They included US marijuana smugglers, but also many Mexican smugglers from, frankly, much lower down the hierarchy of growing and smuggling narcotics, mostly older smugglers from the states of Sinaloa, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. Now, obviously, the last thing I want to say about how I wrote this book was about the writing. And so much important academic literature, from history to sociology to political science, is written, I think, in a bit of a kind of what I class as a kind of high Baroque style, and is kind of impenetrable to the uninitiated. And I think you spend, I'm equally guilty as anyone else of writing in this way. I think you spend most of your PhD in the first decade of your career attempting to ape this style. And even what's known as most pop history is written in what British would call Oxbridge English, but the US you might call Ivy League or New Yorker style. It's all big thesaurus adjectives and forced metaphors. I remember reading, I think it was a year or 2 years ago, These Truths by Jill Lepore, which was meant to be a kind of masterpiece of stylistic history. But I felt I was kind of swimming through a kind of oil slick of verbiage. So what I tried to do with the dope was kind of not write in that style. I tried to capture instead. I read a lot of James Elroy, a lot of Dashiell Hammett, a lot of Raymond Chandler, and I attempted to basically strip away all the extraneous adjectives to tell the story of the Mexican drug trade using techniques drawn from detective literature, right? Short vignettes to introduce the characters, a deliberate staccato beat, action scenes interspersed with background description, a tone of kind of world-weary cynicism. I tried to write, and I realized saying this out loud that it sounds kind of pretentious, but I've tried to write a kind of noir history, effectively. And I'm not sure how successful I did this, but that was what I was attempting to do. So anyway, that's enough about my rather solipsistic discussion of why I wrote the book and how I wrote the book. What's in the book? Well, if you read the book, you can see it deals with about 100 years of Mexican drug smuggling and the efforts against it. You can read about cross-dressing border smugglers like Enrique Fernandez, who pioneered the Ciudad Juarez trade. You could read about Papa Grande, aka Roberto Beltran, who was the kind of counterculture hipsters go-to Sinsemilla vendor. You could read about Arturo El Negro Durazo, the Mexico City police chief who built a mock Greek palace dubbed the Parthenon with the proceeds from the coke trade. But I hope at least there's a bit more to the book than just these relatively entertaining stories. And I wanted to bring out basically 4 essential points that I think my book teaches. Some of them are kind of obvious. The last couple, I think, were not what I expected. The first then is the most obvious, although I also think in some ways the most important. And that is because I think it just gets lost in a lot of the discussion of the trade. Where is that the driving force of the drug trade is, and always has been, economic. America has this enduring and enormous appetite for narcotics that outstrips every other modern nation. In the late 19th century, according to some estimates, I admit I think these were over-exaggerations, but not radical ones, between 2 and 4% of the US population was addicted to morphine. A century later, America was taking 70% of the world's coke, right? This American hunger for intoxication has always dwarfed that of Mexicans. Mexico has not had its own domestic heroin or cocaine market really until the last 10, 15 years. It has had a marijuana market. In actual fact, the term marijuana comes from Mexico, we now think, but it never really extended outside prisoners and members of the armed forces and a small sector of the kind of urban bohemian set. So this ceaseless US demand, this huge US demand for narcotics that's been constant pretty much for the 20th century, has merged with the persistent poverty of the average Mexican. Even during the kind of the golden age of the Mexican economy during the mid-20th century, the average wage in Mexico was around 10% of the wages in the US. Now, the average wage in Mexico is about 6% of what it is in the US. What does this mean? Basically, the combination of high demand and low wages has generated enormous incentives for Mexicans to produce and traffic drugs. And I try to work out my own kind of quantification of this, if you will. So what I did is I matched up wholesale prices of drugs in the United States with average annual Mexican wages. And I found out that in order to earn the average annual wage, the average wage for a whole year, a Mexican would have to produce only 700 grams of marijuana, 18 grams of heroin, or 66 grams of cocaine, and sell it on the US streets. In actual fact, in the mid-1990s, so bad was the Mexican economy, you could earn the average Mexican wage by producing one single marijuana plant or a window box of poppies. So effectively, you can basically make enough to survive on in a year by producing an absolutely infinitesimal amount of drugs. So that was my first finding, was basically all that's driving this is economic, right? It's not Mexican demand for drugs, it's US demand, and it's Mexican poverty that is incentivizing people to get involved in the trade. The second, I thought, perhaps more surprising finding concerned the relationship between the drug trade and the authorities. Since governments prohibited drug trafficking in the 1910s, many Mexican politicians have sought to harness the income from the illegal trade. As long as drugs went north and the trade caused limited social damage in Mexico, no one really blamed the politicians. Who cared? In general, the politicians in Mexico took a cut by instituting what I call a drug protection racket. What did that mean? Well, they basically charged certain favored traffickers a fee in order to protect their enterprise from prosecution. Those that refused to pay, they had arrested or at times murdered. Now, for over a century, observers, particularly US observers, have deemed this system corruption. But I think that corruption is a kind of imprecise and somewhat unhelpful term. It's a blanket expression that basically obscures what is a fairly shifting set of arrangements. And I'm very happy to talk or discuss what people think about what is corruption. Is this corruption? Up until the 1970s then, in Mexico, these protection rackets were controlled by local governments and they were manned by local police. Though many people got very rich out of it, and I don't deny that, there were limits. Local authorities sought to distribute at least some of the funds from drug trafficking, either through official state programs like school or road building, or by forcing the narcos to donate bits of their money in acts of individual philanthropy. So, for example, in the 1930s, Enrique Fernandez, who ran the Ciudad Juarez drug scene, was also building a load of state schools under his name with his money east of Ciudad Juarez in some of the poorest communities. During the 1970s, things, however, did change. National institutions, in particular the Federal Police Force, the PJF, took over these protection rackets. And they brought in a new language when they took them over. They called these protection rackets their plazas. These new racketeers then no longer hailed from the region they controlled. They had no links to the communities or the traffickers that they extorted. So they stole more, they distributed less, and they became increasingly casual about the use of violence. Since 1990, corruption, or what we call corruption, has shifted once more. Increased drug profits and declining state power have upended the old protection rackets. In many regions of Mexico, the traffickers still pay the authorities, but the authorities are no longer in charge. The traffickers are. They control the protection rackets and they decide the rules of the game. Now, political scientists have come up with a term for this arrangement. They call it state capture, but it's not really capture of the entire apparatus of the state. It's rather capture of the protection racket elements of the state. The other thing that I found about corruption is, although Mexican corruption attracted the headlines and attracted the kind of oversimplified cultural explanations, in actual fact, corruption never stopped once you got north of the border. Stories of US sheriffs and principal DEA agents mask similarly entrenched corruption on the US side. Just as in Mexico, enormous profits from the drug trade were tough to resist in the United States. And they persuaded, I found, many agents from local law enforcement, customs, DEA, CIA, to either look the other way or to have exactly the same protection rackets that they had south of the border. So I think that's something that I was really shocked with. It was one of the things that it was most difficult to discover. I still think there's an enormous amount of work to do on that. It was amazing to me. The vast majority of the literature I got on US corruption came from this extraordinary investigation by Arizona journalists during the 1970s, when the mafia had actually blown up the car in which one Arizona journalist was traveling. So his fellow journalists went after corruption in Arizona. But they never bothered to do this in New Mexico. They never bothered to do it in California, and they never bothered to do it in Texas. But my guess is there are similar levels of corruption in those states. The third finding relates to counter-narcotics policies themselves. Drug myths then suggest that punitive policies are logical. They're necessary responses to genuine threats. So policymakers target drug kingpins or peddlers or cultivators because they believe this is the most efficient way to stop Americans injecting or smoking or snorting drugs. But studying a century of Mexican counter-narcotics efforts reveals that such policies are never implemented for their effectiveness. They are driven instead by invented panics, the need for bureaucratic fundraising, and managerial scapegoating. They target whatever group is deemed easiest to cow or capture or sell to the public as a victory. And they're also relentlessly supported by the relentless manipulation of facts and figures, mostly by straight up lying. I think there were at least a dozen DEA agents who admitted that when they caught a kilo of coke, they added a load of milk powder to, so they could double their takeaway. They could look like the bust was massive. So this is just a common thing that drug agents do, right? And it makes them look good, makes them look like they're doing their job. Furthermore, these policies never, ever fulfilled their aims. Cutting supply never raises prices and lowers US addiction rates for more than a few months. I mean, we can see this today, right? We've had, 15 years of the Mexican war on drugs. It's killed well over 200,000 people, and yet it's cheaper to get coke and heroin and get dead through these in the United States than ever before. Last year, 100,000 Americans died of overdoses, despite the money going into the war on drugs south of the border. These policies do nothing. What these unforgiving counter-narcotics policies do cause, however, and this is something lastly I found, was increased violence. So the major cause of the violence I found was the war on drugs itself. In Mexico, aggressive counter-narcotics policing was pretty slow to take off. US diplomatic bullying forced law changes in the 40s, and in the early 50s, there was a militarized eradication campaign. And conflicts did increase, but for the most powerful traffickers, punishments were pretty rare, and there were multiple ways to avoid capture or long imprisonment. But in the 1970s, Nixon's drug war transformed anti-drug policing south of the border. And again, this I think was perhaps my most surprising finding. US drug agents in the 70s, Mexican cops and Mexican soldiers descended on areas of drug production and trafficking, basically like a colonial army. They arrested tens of thousands, they tortured thousands, and they killed hundreds. They racked up their own body count. And there are similar rapid US-backed escalations of drug policing after the murder of the DEA agent Enrique Quique Camarena in 1985, and again with the election of Felipe Calderón in 2006. It's something we're living with still today. However, and this is what I want to end with, beyond these direct victims of drug policing, the people who were tortured or shot by the police, such uncompromising policing also had a crucial secondary effect. Up to the 1970s, most traffickers had cooperated. They were linked by links of friendship, by links of they were related to each other, they came from the same village, and they created these networks of trust between them. Aggressive policing destroyed that. And effectively, as the risks increased, drug traffickers increasingly turned on one another to avoid the threat of capture or torture or being shot by the DEA. So the cooperation that had marked the first half century of the drug trade decreased and then basically evaporated completely. Traffickers gave evidence on each other to escape long sentences, avoid torture, or save their families. And traffickers killed anyone they suspected of being a police informer. Now, I think we can see the highly destructive and quite deliberate counter-narcotics policing over the last 15 years. There you can see, we often, I think the traditional mythology of the drug war in Mexico tells us that cartels are fighting other cartels because they're naturally aggressive, capitalist corporations, if you like. They're all trying to monopolize the drug trade. However, I think the majority of these divisions between the cartels are caused by the US and the Mexican police, who basically need these divisions to get informants to go and rat out the other cartels. So I think they very deliberately engineer these divisions, and then they wedge these divisions open, and then they use these divisions in order to take down various cartel members and hence make their careers, right? So I think that was the thing that really disturbed me. Is a lot of the things that we think is just the natural ebb and flow, the natural conflicts of aggressive men involved in the drug industry are quite deliberately manipulated and manufactured by people doing the drug policing. Right, okay, rant over.